You are seeing in architecture the expressions of a society. The way we used to build has been forgotten. And so part of the challenge for us today is to look back to those things and remember, get inspired, and build better today. Hey, you know, guys, that I'm always talking about how to build better, right? I want us to be master builders. I want us to build better, more beautiful places. Why are we building ugly houses? Our built environment, the buildings that are around us, aren't very inspiring, okay? And they don't follow close architectural traditions that are easy to understand. We talked about in one of my previous videos about around Colonial Williamsburg, you end up seeing a lot of commercial buildings that are inspired by Colonial Williamsburg, inspired by that architecture. If you live in Phoenix or you live in Las Vegas, there's not much to be inspired by out there as far as architecture goes, unless you want to build the Taj Mahal. Now, this building here, it's a utility building, right? It was the telephone building. This is 1932. This is Art Deco architecture built for a commercial utility phone line company. Basically, it's a phone station, right? What are we doing building this kind of architecture for such a utility building? Isn't that interesting that in 1930, we had a different way of thinking about how we were building? We had a different way that even if we're building a warehouse, even if we're building a utility building, it still is important enough that the architecture is beautiful, that the architecture communicates. And so the Art Deco here is this modern classicism that's really very appropriate for the use that was going on here. If you've heard me talk before, I typically our firm does work on pre-1940 houses. Why is that? It's because pre-World War II, okay, we had a different mindset about building than we do post-World War II. And pre-World War II buildings are more beautiful, in my opinion. They have more charm, there's better craftsmanship, they have more architectural interest. That whole attitude was true for commercial buildings as well. And we're going to look in this series at a whole series of commercial buildings, from churches to post offices to high rises, and talk about how that changed, you know, after World War II. What happened to our country? What happened to our value system that we think about building so differently? That a telephone wire building, which would be, you know, out in the middle of a field, right, is somehow beautiful in 1930, and it wouldn't be today. So something's changed, something's going on with our value system and how what we think about it, pushing us towards building cheap and fast and not building beautifully. And the goal would be that we build more beautiful things, that we be more inspired. A glass box that's, you know, 50 stories high isn't very inspiring, especially when there's 8 other buildings around them that look exactly the same. Our downtowns used to be this inspiring. You think about New York, right? You think about the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building, these great Art Deco, wonderful things, the Woolworth Building downtown there, the Singer Building, were all incredible, beautiful high-rises. Then, you know, post-World War II, we just have downtowns that are full of glass boxes, right? Glass towers that all look the same. Now, Art Deco, why is this Art Deco? Okay, so Art Deco is a more modern, okay, building style, but it takes classical proportions, classical detailing, and applies new forms of ornamentation, okay? So you see this panel right here, that sun ray that's going out there, the angular nature of those things, that is them applying, okay, new inspiration, in this case Aztec and Mayan detailing, to a classical form. So if you look at this 3/3 window and that kind of vertical orientation of that panel, right, lifts your eyes. That's a very classical thing. Modernism, it kind of stretches you out wide and long, okay? Classicism lifts up. And all of that ornamentation is a lifting up, is a raising your eye, right? It's inspiring. Notice what's happening too, because the 1950s edition was put on top of this. And look at those windows, okay? Those are steel windows. Those are steel double hung windows. Yes, they're in the 303 pattern, but the wood is downstairs, the steel is upstairs. There's no ornamentation above there in the 50s, right? There's nothing else going on that's inspiring there. They've matched the color of the brick basically, but this kind of 1930s original piece is really beautiful, right? And the 50s it starts getting blander, and the 70s you'll see is the most bland. So, you know, Art Deco is this taking these classical ideals, applying new ornamentation in a very exciting way. I mean, it looks like Hollywood in the 30s or 40s, right? Those look like Hollywood things, and Hollywood was very inspired by this. And this was when the rise of Hollywood is really taking place in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, that golden era, and a lot of it has to do with this architecture. Okay, so now we've walked, you know, down the street, come down this as this building's been elongated, okay? 1970s behind me, can you tell? I mean, what a stark difference between that exciting ornamented Art Deco to this, okay? What's happened, right? What is that, 40 years, okay? From the 50s to the 70s, every 20 years it got changed, and then this is the latest version. I mean, the prettiest part of this side of the building are the trees, okay? So it's almost brutalistic, okay? Brutalism is that heavy concrete kind of thing. This is almost brutalistic in the way it's done. Think about what's changed, guys. I drive by the front of that building and I stop in my tracks and look at it and going, what's going on? I drive by this and I'm never stopping, right? You're not stopping to look at this. It's ugly. It just looks terrible. And so if you talk about contributing to your built environment, contributing beauty, contributing ornamentation, the front side of it does this, the back side doesn't, and that's a shame. And that affects how we're building today. Now let's go back to the office. We'll look at Art Deco architecture. We'll study kind of those details, the greatness of that style, and how it contributes and how it still inspires us today. Okay guys, I wanted to dig down a little bit deeper into Art Deco. You know, we're talking about how pre-1940 things kind of had a different feel than they do post-1940. The Art Deco is a good example of that, because the Art Deco is an architectural style really pushing and interested in modernity. Railroad cars with the sleek designs, airplanes, cars were oftentimes had this elongated, long feel to them. So the art, the chairs, everything was expressive this way. So the thing to know about the Art Deco is that architecturally, it was very similar to classicism. Notice that it accentuates the tall, right? It isn't long and linear, it's tall and vertical. And you can see that with the Empire State Building. Even the writing, the fonts that they were using in the Art Deco era were unique and kind of had their own taste and style. So it was anti-classical because they didn't want to use the same motifs of the Ionic capital or whatever else. But it was very classical because the columns that were there were still spaced and laid out with a classical origin, right? But they were expressed differently. So these columns might just be shafts. Might be fluted shafts, not typically fluted, some kind of different random fluting that would go up, and it would go up and there would be no capital. The proportions are there, but the expression is different, right? So you're looking at Art Deco and you are seeing a different expression, okay? So whether it's on the interior, this is the Empire State Building, that great scene from Elf with him going in, and that's where his dad works.
Looks like a Christmas tree.
What you'll see here is this zigzag architecture, and in New York City, okay, when the high rises were going up and going on, they oftentimes had to cut back the top of the building so that more light could end up down at the street. So it was a building code that ended up changing the way things looked. And so an interesting kind of a little aside there. But the Art Deco is a beautiful, ornamentive, expressive style of architecture that I love. It's kind of anti-classical and classical at the same time. It was a rejection of all those old looks, but it was certainly an embracing of those classical details and proportion and scale. The other thing that's happening with Art Deco is, remember, we're just coming out of World War I. World War I was a groundbreaking event in world history because it was gruesome, it was bloody, it was terrible. Part of the rejection of that classical was we need to think of things new. There was also an excitement about the future. There was an excitement about cars and railroad travel and art and movies and all of these different things. So the Roaring 20s, all part of this same time, was a time of growth, a time of prosperity. And so there was a exuberance and excitement with Art Deco as well, which is why it's expressed so wonderfully in the buildings and in the architecture. Remember that what happens after this is we end up going into World War II in the 1940s. And so within a 20 or 30 year period, this groundswell of change has taken place. We've gone through 2 world wars, and we are no longer thinking about architecture the way we were, right? There's no longer this desire for ornamentation. The rejection of that, the things that take place, the reason we build that telephone building with the Art Deco and that beautiful expression, and by the time you get to the 1970s, it's that brutal architecture with just no expression, very ugly, blank walls, right? And brutalistic architecture is basically concrete buildings. Boston City Hall is a great example of brutal architecture. It's ugly, it's hard, it's dark. That's how we've changed. You are seeing in architecture the expressions of a society, the expressions and the beliefs, right? The point of this series is to talk about why our houses are ugly. Why are we building things that don't make sense? What's happened, right? Well, coming out of World War II, you have a credible housing crisis. And so part of the challenge for builders at the time was building cheap and fast. There's an attitude about building, especially when you have the rise of Levittown, you have the rise of production builders. Realize before this time, there aren't production builders, right? There's a book called American Housing, which studied the housing industry right around the 1930s and 1940s. One thing it said about houses before the Great Depression was that houses had been crafted, had been built individually one at a time, were not built by large production builders, weren't built with heavy and capital intensive products. And they wanted to, right? And so they were looking at the industry going, we need to speed this industry up. Guys like William Levitt came along and started building houses cheap and fast. And 2 generations later, we've kind of forgotten, and this reason why I always talked about the lost art of building. 2 generations of building cheap and fast means that the way we used to build, okay, has been forgotten. And so part of the challenge for us today is to look back to those things and remember and get inspired and build better today. Next week, we're going to stay in kind of that government building style, and we're going to look at a post office. And there's a great historic post office here in Fort Worth. We're going to look at it, and then one that was built about 15 years ago, and the contrast is stunning. So come join us next time as we study what happened to housing and what happened to housing design.